Hi, I'm Willa Harlow Ross.
Hi, I'm Devin Scott, and we're here together. Yay! Hello.
Welcome to Film Formally, a podcast where we break down
the studio.
Where we break down the building blocks of cinema, one technique at a time.
Visit filmformally.com for archival episodes and show notes, a link to our Discord server, or just to say hi.
Can I just say before we keep going that this is a very strange gag.
This is a nightmare. This is a nightmare.
Devin had the idea of, well, while we're in person, we might as well record this intro together. And what if we were in the same room, but facing different respective cameras while we were in the frame with each other? And I don't think, however strange the setup may seem to you watching it, I don't think it's as strange as it feels to be sitting here with my back to him, staring at a camera.
This is making me realize why most podcasts sit around a table facing each other. I now realize why that is the case. Okay, so mistakes have been made. We're closer than ever and more distant than ever. Isn't that ironic? We have a fun episode today, our first interview style episode for the Film Formally, The Return, as we are now officially calling it. That is the official name, officially.
Dirk Meier, who is a colorist who's worked on a ton of, I think it's fair to say, seminal films in the canon of digital cinema, as distinct from like cinema shot on film, like 35 millimeter, like major participant on a number of groundbreaking digital works that could only look the way they did as digital works.
He's worked on such films as Russian Ark, Antichrist, Dread, which we all love the noise patterns of, and recently Secret Agent and other films such as Happy as Lazzaro.
Yeah, what I like about this conversation that the two of you have, it forms a really interesting narrative of the almost accidental way that that these seminal moments in production, in the way that an art form develops, in the way that media is formed, how almost accidental major parts of that can be. Right? You'll hear him describe it for himself, but there are elements of pure chance that lead to just this major role within the development of what digital images can even be, and how they negotiate aesthetically with our idea of how films are supposed to look, which is largely rooted in film, and how the idea of a film look is its own kind of shifting target and shifting set of tools available for films. That's just really exciting. So for as in the weeds as the conversation gets, as a conversation between two colorists, you get to really hear this clear arc over time.
His, I think, reputation precedes him, I hope, if you're listening to a podcast this niche. Without further ado, I think we can switch over to our little talk with Dirk, and then we'll see you afterwards. Haha. Hello, welcome back. We're here with Dirk Meier, colorist and educator. And I think so far on this podcast, I've yet to have a guest who has contributed more than one film to my letterbox list of digital cinema. I maintain a list of, I think, films that use digital in interesting ways. You've been involved in no less than 3 films on this list: Dread, Antichrist, and Russian Ark. So until I get the Steven Soderberghs and Anthony Dodmantles and Jafar Panahis of the world, who have done 4 respectively, you have a rather insurmountable lead so far. So my congratulations to you for that.
Thank you.
I'll post a link to that in the show notes. But you've been involved as a colorist on, I think, films that people who, if you're in the Venn diagram, who listen to this podcast, you have watched these films. Secret Agent, Happy as Lazzaro, a couple of Roy Andersson films that are very near and dear to my heart. A Pigeon Sat in a Branch, reflecting on existence and about endlessness. Antichrist, among many other films. You've kind of been there and seen it all in terms of the development of modern digital imaging workflows. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Fantastic introduction. Yeah, very charming.
So today we are going to be kind of using your experiences as an entree to discuss your views on what constitutes the aesthetics of an image, right? The look development process, we call it as colorists. And so, as a way into that, I'd like to start by talking about your experiences in the kind of the early pioneering days of digital cinema, by which I especially mean your work on Alexander Sakharov's Russian Ark and your experiences there with the various systems that had to be essentially invented to work with this absolutely daffy film. For those of you, for the one or two people listening to this who don't know Russian Ark, it is a film shot entirely in the Hermitage Museum in a single 80-plus minute take on a Steadicam on, I believe, the Sony HDW F900 system. But I love to hear your experiences on that and what you saw and what had to be invented for this film.
Yes, that is a very special project. Still also, of course, in my career. And I'm very happy to have been around by that time. Also telling that I'm kind of old by terms of digital cinema now, being in my early 50s now. I was just there when post-production got the chance to digitize pictures in enough quality to actually manipulate them, which we then called the digital intermediate process. And at the same time, digital cameras kind of increasing the recording resolution that they would also kind of at least think they're good enough for the big screen. So that's what Sony at least thought. So it was the Sony F900 that was
string of alphanumerical things.
They had a built-in tape recording system. And my background, maybe to roll back a little bit, why I ended up in the Hermitage pushing the actual record button on an external hard drive recorder started a couple of years earlier in about 1998 when I co-founded a company called Director's Friend. Back then I was basically just turned from intern doing a little internship just because I thought I need a few months of training so I can apply for film school. I had an interest in cinematography, so that kind of was my plan. But then I kind of got stuck in this little, very interesting company in Cologne and worked on some commercials, shot on 35, shot on digital Betacam, which was the standard broadcast technology back then. But I worked as a clipper loader on those commercials, shot on 35 and on 16, got to shoot some 60mm stuff myself, which exposed me to all these different kind of media and the technology, where I always had like an interest in like the upcoming nonlinear editing systems and so on. And in 98, the founder of that company, like being 10 years older, he had the idea to create this system that you could bring on set to record on hard drives, so on a nonlinear system, so you could play back stuff immediately while you were actually shooting 35mm film by recording the video assist signal. Very, very low quality, of course, but it gave you the opportunity to actually start editing on set or review things like much faster and easier than normally by rolling back the videotape that was used as the video assist back then. In 2000, again, my partner there, Erhard Giesen, was he was always kind of very sensitive to new trends, and we were running around the NEB trade show, and everyone was talking about 24p, which was like the synonym for like digital high definition. And Sony was marketing their cameras as the new digital film cameras. And we thought, okay, our editing system, which was meant to be like portable, this system we call DF Cine, whatever film stream, DF Cine FS, is a hard disk recorder with workstation hardware with a power supply that could run on batteries. Not very long, because we're talking about a full workstation computer there with 2 screens and so on. In 2000s, like this one was kind of the last version in terms of hardware. In 2002, introduced together with the Viper camera.
So this was a sort of a high-powered portable digital intermediate device, or a sort of a almost like a DIT station that fit in it could almost like collapse down to almost like a briefcase form factor, although it seemed quite a bulky briefcase.
Yes, indeed. You could fit it in a suitcase, but it was pretty heavy. Yes, we're talking, I don't know, somewhere in the specs it would even say, I guess, how heavy it is. Or maybe we didn't. Well, no, that was just the battery. I think we skipped that because it was not a good number. But here, yeah, like 20 kilograms. So putting it on an airplane, you needed a rather lightweight suitcase to put it there.
So it's just underneath like the at least current international standards for a checked bag.
The idea was back then from my partner that it's a nice idea, and it's of course the logic next step to move the capture side of things also to digital. We know this today. It's obvious. There is still, of course, 35 mil and 16 and photochemical film material as capture medium. But the majority, of course, today is all like digital sensors, digital cameras. Back then in 2000, it was, of course, the opposite. It was just everything for theatrical release was shot 35. Yet Sony had this new kind of broadcast, high definition digital broadcast camera, and thought putting this out as a digital film camera to venture into new markets. At least that's my take on it. And for Russian Ark, to come back to that project, the basic problem was the F900 was a broadcast camera with like small tapes. And the recording duration for that tape was like 45 minutes. That's it. To go longer than that, you would need a usual kind of studio tape deck. And in comparison, that was much bulkier and heavier than our system. So in 2001, in summer, when it actually, the production kind of went on and they actually did some tests, someone trying to carry around the studio deck, they figured it's not really possible. And somehow my partner heard of this production, got in touch with the it was a Berlin-based production company that owned two Sony F900 cameras and post-production systems and a bit of VFX hard and software. And they were immediately interested because they understood it's probably not feasible to find any other solution there to record more than the 45 minutes. And they really, like the whole concept was this must be like a one-take thing.
And this was impossible on film, right? Because the length of film reels. I mean, Rope, for example, has like the 8 or 9 hidden cuts because they had to. And so this would have been quite groundbreaking.
Absolutely. As far as I know, back then it was the very first actual like one-take movie. And I think today it's still, and probably for the future as well, there might be more one-take movies, but this is probably the only one where actually only one take exists. There was never done a full second take.
I think outside the world of like James Benning landscape films, this is probably still the case. In the package you sent over, there are some, I think, very interesting photographs of this system in action. And so for the audio listeners, what we're seeing here is a photograph of a very harried assistant holding what looks like the 20-kilogram briefcase on his back, ostensibly for an 80-minute take. But take it away, Dirk. What are your war stories about this one?
It wasn't as like heavy or difficult. I wasn't the one to actually carry it for the 90 minutes, but I tried this for like some tests and during some of the rehearsals the week before, maybe for 30 minutes or something. It was fine with a solid kind of backpack rig. It was okay. The whole thing was probably more than 20 kilograms because we had, in this case, to put the 6 hard drives inside, plus a custom-made battery for around 2,500 euros of lithium ion power to run the 100 to 120 minutes with a bit of safety in there. We had to put that on top as well. So what you see here is the group of crew around the director and the Steadicam operator, then DOP, Tilman Büttner. There's a focus puller. There's Stefan Schuppeck, who was the DIT setting up the camera. A menu, which back then really meant you had to go very deep into the Sony engineering menu to tweak the gamma curve, the highlight, the shadow detail, saturation, and so on, to give you a decent picture, because we're also talking about either tape or our recording would only do 8-bit. So you had to find a good balance between a contrasty but still malleable kind of signal for the final grading then. You can see the little green BNC wire connecting the Steadicam and the camera with our recorder.
And if I'm understanding correctly, the kind of balance here is because it's 8-bit is so you only have the 256 graduations between an unsaturated and fully saturated, pixel. And so, but if you and so the lower your contrast, the more inefficient the usage of that kind of quantized steps go. But if you raise the contrast too much, you lose the dynamic range, right? You have a smaller target to hit. Is that kind of expressed accurately for the benefit of the audience?
Yes, totally. Yeah, that's still today the case if you have small DSLR cameras or mirrorless cameras with various codecs. If you use a codec that only has 8-bit, it's not very advisable to use like a super flat log curve like Sony S-Log3, because then you're wasting a lot of bits. Eventually, you need to expand the contrast to get you like a display referred, like a normal looking picture. And then you might not have enough gradation in between the signal that you want. That's your picture. So then you might end up with artifacts, seeing actual like steps, quantization steps.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to have a more contrasty curve that makes use of those 250 steps. And that was the case back then, because even though the camera would be able to output 10-bit over SDI, that would mean we would not have enough recording time. Back then, we're talking about like how big was it? Like 76 gigabyte SCSI drives, I believe. So if you do all the math and so on, we had to record uncompressed. That was the big benefit quality-wise over the tape, which was very much compressed and downsampled in terms of color sampling, and even Luma sampling. HD was like, yeah, pretty bad in those numbers, like the tape, the HD cam tape. But there was no hardware that would do a real-time compression as we have today to do like a ProRes codec on the fly or something. That didn't exist, which is important to understand for the younger kids today. We had to deal with like uncompressed signals and so on. And then 8-bit, 10-bit, that's like just 20% more recording time that you need. And then we would have only been able to capture like 60-something minutes, where this wasn't enough. So this was all the kind of compromises we had to find.
This might be data that's lost to history, but just out of curiosity, a full single 80-minute take for Russian Ark, how big was that file once written to the hard drives?
It was basically, if I'm correct with the drive, it was 6 times, let's do the math, 6 times around 450 gigabytes.
At the time, that's unfathomable for me.
6 times 76 gigabyte hard drives. That was basically the maximum that existed back then. They were all striped as a RAID 0 for maximum capacity. So there was no chance for failure or no safety net at all. The system had to record into as kind of special file system to be able to maintain the data rate. That's where we used actually German technology, a company called DVS, became famous for the Clipster as a mastering system later. They had hardware that would basically just use the hard drives as a bunch of disks, assign their own kind of raster, depending on, okay, we're going to have a 8-bit YUV 422 signal that's coming in, and they would just dump the actual RGB turned YUV pixels coming from the SDI stream and would write them as they are on a kind of unformatted disk set of these 6 drives. And that was the only way back then to maintain these data rates. Also, like 2 years later, or 1 year and a bit later, with the introduction of the Viper film stream camera, we went to RGB and 10-bit, and the Viper was the first, I would say, raw camera in a way that they had the idea to encode the signal into a log signal, similar to Cineon log, and turn off all the processing in camera. So there was no sharpening, no detail, no highlight, whatever. It was a fixed gamma curve, a log curve, and without even a white balance button and so on. So that was very, very new. With a lot of concepts that are still very valid today and in use today. And then it was like an RGB 10-bit signal that we used still uncompressed, doubling the data rate of what we had basically for Russian Ark.
It's worth putting a little underline on the introduction of logarithmic encoding to digital sensor, like image capture technology, which is that this is kind of still the basis for how we kind of build our looks nowadays. We're still basically using that same kind of image pipeline, more or less, obviously with many bells and whistles now. And so, that's that same kind of the idea of the quote unquote like raw. There's a lot of asterisks there, but raw, raw files where you're really just dealing with a log image with a lot of ability to kind of futz with metadata and stuff. That's what ARRI. That's what if you're shooting an ARRI camera, red camera, et cetera, that's basically what you're doing most of the time. So Antichrist, this is a film that you mentioned earlier to me, kind of aggressively manipulated in post, and also one of your early experiences with kind of pre-production look development and getting into more standardized workflows. I'd love to hear you speak to that experience of kind of developing that movie with Anthony Dodmantle, the cinematographer.
Yep. It is still today a very special movie for myself and a very important part, a milestone in my career as well. Just to bridge that little gap from 2001 roughly and 2009 with all the experience I had with this company that was mostly putting hardware together. We were not really building, designing special like computer hardware ourselves, but we were picking things from very niche companies together for an application that wasn't yet really conceived in a way to capture live on set digitally. And that gave me the introduction to people like very, very smart camera engineers at Philips, then Thomson, later building this Viper camera, which also introduced me to this concept of like, what is a log curve and where does it come from? And there was the Cineon system from Kodak. Back then, I learned about these bits and pieces. I met some really clever and smart people. We did some very simple 1D LUT real-time color grading within our system because, if you see like a green tinted log picture on set, I mean, that's not really nice for anyone really, except for someone maybe wanting to judge the exposure or whether you're clipping something. So we needed a real-time manipulation of that. And it also brought me into a couple of very early on DI suites from Hollywood to Paris to Germany, where I really saw the pioneers in digital post-production, like high-end DI color grading, how they work, how the transition and the combination from all the photochemical experience with the digital material and the film out process, which we still had to use, how that works. And that really triggered my personal interest as well. Whereas before Director's Friend, my goal somehow was to go and study cinematography and become a cinematographer. One part I learned, or maybe I'm not really the type of cinematographer that I thought I could be, experiencing some other people. And one thing was, I'm so interested in this old technology and putting this together creatively with manipulating images. And maybe my future path should be something else. And then I met these colorists and saw the color grading suites and the possibilities. And I thought, wow, here it all comes together. So after we had to close the company because we were basically too early and didn't make any money and so on, by a few very lucky encounters of people, I got into beta testing a software that was like computer software only for color grading. Worked at a local broadcast company in Cologne where I really got to learn the basics of, okay, here's a tape, you got to read it in, do a scene cut detection, just match things and improve it a little bit with a Pandora Poggle in like 45 minutes of stuff in like an 8-hour shift, but you also got to play it out in the end again. So that really trained some muscle memory and some kind of basic understanding as well. And with the former partner, Erhard Giesen of this Darkest Friend company, he always had like a production company, which we then thought, why not start into this post-production business? So I helped him setting up a facility, like a boutique facility in Cologne, and using that new color grading software where I was basically the first colorist. So everything kind of came together, and Antichrist was the first kind of pinnacle of all these things coming together, because I met Stefan Čupek again. He was the DIT from Russian Ark and became a close friend over the years and helped me getting into color grading, also introduced me to other facilities. My business partner, he was basically a friend with the German co-production for Centropa, the production company of Lars von Trier. So they wanted to shoot actually near Cologne, the cabin, and a couple of other scenes that were shot in Germany. So everything came together, and I became the dailies colorist, and Stefan, who from DIT, meeting Anthony Mantel, becoming his kind of sidekick, digital camera supervisor, second unit DP, up until Dread. He also really early on suggested that we should do the color grading together. So eventually I was not only doing the workflow with this Red 1 camera, which back then was still pretty new and still a bit bumpy in the whole workflow process, but I also became, as a team, together with Stefan, the final colorist, which was a great experience, but also a very exhausting experience, because we were pushing on every kind of edge. The whole dailies processing during production was already not as smooth as I had hoped. And similarly in final grading, which was scheduled to be like 15 days, 3 weeks, ended up being like 5 weeks, with eventually really doing double shifts with the on location kind of, we were grading in Sweden, the DI kind of assist coming in between my shift and Stefan's shift, somewhere around maybe 3 o'clock in the morning, inserting the latest VFX shots before I would start in the morning at 8 again, before Stefan would come in the afternoon, something like that. So in the end, it was like very, very tough. Yeah. But at the same time, it was so rewarding and fulfilling to work with these great images. I think for the first time, the use of slow motion, the use of digital high speed was done in a way that it really served storytelling purposes. And before, on photochemical film stock, you could do high speed, but it was so limited in terms of the duration and how much you could do and how much light you would need and so on. So that was very, very like maybe for very short moments, for very special moments and so on. But here the whole prologue and a couple of other long scenes or shots in the film were all shot at like 1,000 frames per second, combined in multi-layer visual effects work, and then graded with like tons of layers, which also took like a long time. And because I was there from the beginning, it was also the first time I really have been involved in this and had a session that really deserved the name Look Development, because they had the chance to shoot in the woods near the cabin, with the cabin already set up. They explored various cameras with the lens babies. I have some stills actually from that. If you've seen the film, you know where these shots are used and that they really serve the purpose of showing the torn kind of psychedelic world. And that does work, I think, to a great deal to make you feel this anxiety that Charlotte Gainsbourg experiences in there.
Yeah, it's I mean, to your slow motion note, it's definitely because I have a very good memory of my first screening of Antichrist, where people actually ran out of the cinema screaming. It was quite a harrowing experience. It was 11 in the morning at Vancouver Film Festival, and not a great brunch movie for the Vancouver folks, I bet. But yeah, it was definitely made this major impression, at least on us, because I was in film school at the time, on the camera people in my orbit, as maybe the first time we could think of that degree of slow motion being used in such a artistically ambitious way, you know, not just in a commercial for a car or something. Yeah, it made a huge impression. It's funny, even at the time, we it wasn't a film that a lot of us thought, oh, that's digital look development. But it really, I think, is a film that takes advantage of the kind of increased almost latitude. I want to say, I don't mean that in the photochemical way of like dynamic range, but just the fact that tools at this point had gotten to a place where you could kind of elegantly push the images to such extremes digitally in a way that wasn't quite. I mean, I watch early 2000s digital films, and a lot of them are incredible, but they're rougher around the edges in a way that I don't think was aesthetically amenable to this movie. So this film, I think, was a part of that wave of kind of almost like a refinement and increasing of the further, both the refinement and the broadening of what was possible with digital color grading and look development.
And there I have to say we did rely quite a bit on what film has done many, many years before. Because in that time, 2008, 2009, dealing with these new digital cameras, and this was mainly the red camera. Arri was still thinking whether they should or not should release a digital camera and kind of eat up on their own market of film cameras, while Red was pushing ahead and releasing a 4K camera and having basically the owners doing the beta testing for them, which was a very different approach, but it really stirred up the market. But there was very little experience how to deal with that. With my experience from those early, like F900 and other kind of broadcast camera style things, I knew at least how to technically work with that footage, what a log to video or cinema conversion would do. At the same time, we didn't have the tools to manipulate individual colors as carefully and as smooth as we can do today with a lot of software tools, plugins, and so on, which we'll talk about later. But back then, it was basically okay to make the picture look really nice and more to what we're used to. We kind of need to imply or apply somewhere a film emulation. For that film, it was also clear, well, main distribution will still be on 35 mil. So anyway, we were looking at a DI pipeline. Just now, instead of scanning film from acquisition, from photocamera acquisition, we just feed it the somehow loggish material from a red camera. We grade it with the print film emulation lookup table on the output, and we put it on the Arri laser and actually shoot it out to 35 mil film.
And that brought with it some challenges, right? I mean, you mentioned that the initial 35 mil screening at Cannes had some issues.
The other was a very particular one. The issues before in the actual color grading process was that also for the facility in Sweden, they hadn't done like real feature film gradings there before. So we needed to fly in someone who would do the calibration for the crystal projector. We had DCI and DCI projection was still being defined. It was there, but there weren't too many like full DCI capable projectors, and not in too many cinemas yet in 2009. So that was all like pretty much new territory, and that had a couple of challenges. Plus, on one of the pictures you saw, there was Peter Jord next to Stefan Jubek. Peter Jord's like a genius VFX supervisor and also color graded a couple of films, Oscar-winning Susanne Bier films, and he was also the mastermind because some of these visualization shots were multiple recordings were combined. We then put like 25 layers of grading on top in the Nakoda, which kind of broke down the machine already. So these were the challenges during production, plus the deadline for the Cannes premiere, where we had to deal with like incoming VFX shots and so on, and Lars von Trier not willing to come to Sweden for the final grading. This was maybe one of the biggest challenges in the whole process, because then some of us had to, like either Stefan or me on the weekend, were driving back to Copenhagen on a train with a playout on HD cam tape and showing the current state of the grade to him, and then coming back with notes. The big disappointment, at least for Stefan and myself and the ones who actually worked on the grading, including Anthony, and seeing it in the grading suite, was that the film projection, and we had the decision, are we going to show the DCP, which was possible, or are we going to show the film print? And we did like that the actual film out would add these image attributes that we still kind of hadn't fully defined and figured out, and being able to manipulate ourselves in grading for the digital version, like the gate weave, the little bit of scratches and so on, everything that we kind of got used to see and somehow like or not like so much, but that just triggers everyone's mind. Okay, this is like so many people call the organic film look, but we also kind of showing more or less side by side or after each other the DCP and the film print, that the film print does this little extra kick from the digital acquisition, which was not, like, we didn't have too much latitude and so on. We were fighting all these things that you mentioned as well, and the film print helped, but the film print in Cannes looked maybe with a quarter to half CTB more bluish than it should be. And the only explanation I got was that there are different heat protection glasses in the projectors, in the film projectors, and some are more bluish and some are more kind of orangey. So the opening of the film is black and white. And Anthony had insisted on printing that in the lab rather bluish because he was really afraid of it becoming too sepia, too warm. He wanted to feel rather harsh and not too pleasant. But now you watched it with a strong blue tint, and that was like my personal main disaster at the premiere in Cannes. But nevertheless, it was quite successful.
This might be a good juncture to kind of at least make a stab at defining look development, because this is the point at which that really comes into force in a more robust way in your work. And so I want to ask you, what the hell is look development? What does that entail in a way that the phrase, for example, as colorists, people are probably think that we color correct or color grade. What defines look development as distinct from those two things?
I would say at first that someone thinks about the look before they end up being in the color grading suite at the end of the process of filmmaking. That's the first priority. Someone actually really has to have an invested interest in thinking and talking and then creating about what the look of this whole project, film, series, episode, whatever, moving picture content has to be or should be. If that is acknowledged and DPs, directors, and producers agree, hey, we should do this, we should actively investigate what is the look of our show, then they should find the collaborator, which is a colorist, and assign the time to really research about this. And then you need, as ingredients, you need the people or the creatives, minds and taste, plus expectations of what this film or project should look like, the material to actually play around with, from a camera test, lens test, hair and makeup, costume test, so that you can try and explore how do we achieve what the other people or like everyone has in mind for this. That for me is the development process, really, and that should happen or kind of needs to happen before principal photography, because then it can really influence everything that happens during the actual shooting. It can tell also not only the DP but also costume designers, production designers, art directors, what kind of props to put in the frame, how to color them, how to light them, and so on. And then ideally you have something very, very solid and very good looking already and pleasing for everyone involved before you actually meet again in the color grading suite for the final grade.
So in a robust, I think, healthy process, you see the job of colorists, or I guess only one part of the look development team is the colorist, but it's a key part, starting very early in the process, right? It's not something you impose upon whatever has been gathered on the set. It's something where what you're doing works in tandem to change what you're shooting on the set, basically, right? You are calibrating what you are shooting, what I might call the data you're gathering, to arrive at a look that has been preordained, even if bends in the river occur later on due to serendipity, that sort of thing. Two of your kind of ensuing collaborations, I think, might provide interesting counterpoints with regards to look development processes. You have a couple of films that you mentioned directed by Roy Andersson, which are Pigeon Set on the Beach, Reflecting on Existence, and About Endlessness. And you've also worked, I think, 5 times with Hélène Louvart. And I found your description of the working processes of look development of both those such an interesting contrast, right? Where one of those artists, Roy Andersson, you mentioned there's sort of a hyperclinical, pre-planned, everything is in place before shooting starts. And then working with Hélène Louvart is often a more kind of seat of your pants experience in many ways. Both those, I think both of those results speak for themselves. I just watched Happy as Lazarro last night, and that's a seat of your pants movie if there ever was one. Or something like Romeria, where there's this kind of multi-format approach that I found very thrilling.
For those who haven't seen a Roy Andersson film, well, just Google him and look at some of the commercials that you find, or short movies that you find online, and you will always recognize this particular style, like this whole visual aesthetics. And in a way, that also means, well, in terms of look development, there wasn't much to do because he had found his trademark look like over the years before, already perfecting it. But the 4 previous, he did like his early Swedish Love Story, which is more like a normal feature film, which kind of was very, very successful in Sweden. And then years later, after hundreds of commercials that he also did, which allowed him to build his own studio in the center of Sweden with a kind of workshop and a studio to shoot there. He started doing these feature films with this very distinct look. 2 of them, the first 2 on 35mm, with basically everything as practical VFX on set, in camera, like classic matte painting, trompe-l'oeil painting, like between camera and the set. It's so fascinating. There are beautiful documentaries about it. Go and watch this. It's so amazing to see how differently you can also make films and have been done compared to we do this and then we just go and VFX and da. It was super interesting for me to join these projects. At the same time, it was kind of clear, okay, the makeup's going to be like this, the whole color palette will be like very, very kind of, if you look at the vector scopes, like just around the center point, a little bit of noise, because all the colors are very muted, and that's part of the design, it's part of the feeling that he wants to create. But at the same time, here, look development was maybe also a little bit of just workflow support from my side, because they bought their own red camera, or maybe roll back. How they shoot is Roy writes the script in terms of scenes, and then every scene, once he's sure how it should be, is basically built in their own studio, like the whole scenario. It's almost always a lock-off camera setup. Once they rehearsed it enough times, they're going to shoot it for 1 day or maybe 2 days. They do as many takes as they think they need. And when it's done and they're happy, they go up 1 floor, they celebrate, have a drink, and then the next morning or next Monday, when it was in the weekend, then they basically just tear down the set and build the next one. And that's why also these productions take years to finish, like 3 to 4 years, basically, the last 2. And I guess for the previous ones, it was the same. So they bought their own Red One camera because it was much cheaper for them to own it. So then they could always rehearse and always test and always see a picture and so on, than to rent a film camera before. So that was very liberating for them. The problem was a little bit, no one had experience with that. And before, Gergely Palos came in as a kind of trainee working in the set department first. He is an Hungarian cinematographer, had just finished film school back then in 2012 when they started on The Pigeon. He eventually became a co-DP on that because he knew much more about camera and digital and so on. And I came in there just before and helped the kind of film cinematographer. He was basically used just how film works to properly expose, to set up and calibrate the displays in the studio, because they would work so much with what they see. It was so important for them, building everything so that it looks correct in camera. They didn't want to do, they were not used to the idea that they would manipulate or could manipulate the images after it's been recorded. So they tried to perfect everything in camera. So the picture on the monitor was like very important. And when they unfortunately rated the camera higher than it actually is, they thought it's all too bright and they just kind of stopped down, underexposing some of the scenes quite a bit. So these were things where I came in, but more as a kind of workflow consultant, maybe a little bit of an educator between about these workflows, and to set up so that we had a smooth transition into the final grading, conform, etc. Also for myself, maybe less of a look development experience that was like, oh wow, we really reinvented everything. But it was so great to see them also on location in Sweden, like how this all works. And then to meet eventually in the final grading suite, but also having been in touch with the people that did the VFX. So on those films, there's a combination of in-camera effects and still matte paintings that basically painted the roof on a piece of cardboard that would be in between the camera and the actual set, so that they could light from the top and everything in the studio, but you would see a perfectly, like perspectively, perfectly matching ceiling because it was painted like to every little detail on a piece of cardboard that was just like 2 meters, 3 meters away from the camera. And on some scenes, they found out, okay, but it's easier to do some things in VFX. And that was also a big part then of my work, to communicate with the VFX artists, because it took months and months over those 3 years, going back and forth and so on, giving them feedback in a language they would understand better, or I would translate from what Roy and the team would think, and talk with the VFX artists directly after I understood what they're aiming for.
Interesting that that there's this kind of, I think, almost false dichotomy that is often spoken of in terms of this idea that the idea of getting everything in the camera, right? Having the frame that you look at on set be the frame that you want, and I think that something that is often missed about, especially by people outside of the the nitty gritty look development world, about look development, is that oftentimes to arrive at the look, even if it's been preordained to the letter, is you have to gather an image on set that I use the phrase aesthetically arbitrary intermediate state. If I were to give a metaphor for it, it's if you need to shoot something at a target that's really far away, you often need to aim higher.
Mm-hmm.
Or account for the curvature of the earth. And the same thing applies to cinematography, where, to me, oftentimes if I want a scene that's dark, I will either myself, if I'm, God help them if I'm shooting something, or generally if I'm color grading, I will recommend hey, expose for a stop higher than you need with X, Y, and Z caveats, and that sort of thing. Or, this person's shirt doesn't have to be this exact shade, but it needs to be X, Y, or Z shade for me to work it into that shade consistently, et cetera, et cetera. And so those two things can be true, where just because you're not seeing the final image on the set, I mean, one should with a DIT who does the on-set monitoring, but just because the camera is not gathering that exact info in a one-to-one way doesn't mean you're fixing it in post necessarily or anything.
That's a very good analogy with aiming higher to hit something very, very far away. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This contrasts interestingly with your work with a few directors, with the cinematographer Hélène Louvart, I've become quite a fan of hers over the past few years. I've kind of stumbled into a bunch of her films. I think starting with Varda, her work with Alice Rohrwacher, and also like Romeria and such. And I think she's one of the most interesting cinematographers currently working that I've seen. And yet, her work is very diverse in its looks, often within the same film. Where something like Romeria has very like 16 mil looking stuff that looks like it's been stepped on. I'm actually not quite sure what the main stuff in Romeria was shot on. I was trying to figure out while watching it. And same thing with the MiniDV. The character has a MiniDV camera in the film. I was pixel peeping the whole time going, is this emulated or not? And to your immense credit, I could not figure it out, which is very rare. I think it's if anything, it's tougher to emulate believable low-grade digital than it is to emulate film. At least I've seen a much lower batting average outside of whatever geniuses are working at documentary now that nail it every time. So your experience working with Hélène, oftentimes, you might not have very little look development time in prep. What does that look like? How do you arrive at, nonetheless, such kind of strident, interesting imagery?
The main reason why there's never really time for look development on her projects, at least for me when I work with her, is she is just not available. Because she's shooting all the time. And when she's not shooting, she's color grading somewhere else in the world. Or maybe she's grading with me, but then at the same time, she's prepping another project and then again, not available for anything like a big task and look development. It's not completely true, but the one session I had before she went on shooting with her was a remote session. She was in London preparing a film.
Firebrand.
Firebrand, exactly. I still haven't seen it. I think it was never released in Germany. That was, again, not really a great look development thing. It was like a remote session between Cologne and London, just one day with a bunch of material. It was more like, okay, we need to see this. We need to see the costumes. We need to see that. There was not much time to play around and say, okay, we're going to build a lot from this. No room really for that. And then it also turned out, oh yeah, but we actually have a deal with this post house in London, and I cannot be part of this deal. So I also did not do the final grading. And on all the other films, it was basically we exchanged maybe some emails up front, but we only met the first day in the final grading. Really, okay, here's the footage. Okay, what are we going to do? What kind of LUT did you use for the rushes and so on? And then sometimes you wanted me to use that LUT, which someone else had done for another film. And then it's always like, yeah, okay, let's look at it. On Romeria, it was similar. In that case, the main footage was Alexa 35.
Oh, wow. Because there's no information online about it that I could find, at least. I fully assumed it was like, like Chimera and Happy as Lazaro shot on actual film. That's incredible. That is unbelievable. It's not often that I'm fully fooled. So that's amazing.
I tried to take notes. No, it was Alexa 35 for all contemporary footage. Some kind of smaller 4K progressive Sony camera, not like a FX3 or something I had never heard of. I could find out in some emails. That was used to shoot the kind of documentary MiniDV footage. So it was 4K and it was progressive. And then during the grading, Carla Simon, the director, shows references to me, which are the actual videos that she took back then. The story is a lot based on her own biography. And so she had digitized some of those, or transferred some of those MiniDV tapes a while ago and was showing them to me. And we were discussing what they like about it. What does it make to them if they see that, which triggers her memory and so on. And a big part besides, okay, the very low resolution, blown out highlights, the kind of compression artifacts you see, was that it had these interlaced artifacts. When you just put the two fields together, and you don't take care of it, and you don't de-interlace the footage, then you end up with, whenever there's some motion, you see these jagged lines because you see two at different time recorded fields now in one frame. Something that probably a lot of young people don't really know what it is and how it happens. If not, I can absolutely recommend Captain Disillusion's videos on the basic of moving images, I think. He has a super fun video about interlace. Go and watch it so then you understand.
If you're listening on YouTube, I will put it in the annotations.
The problem, of course, here, as a maybe nerdy dive into some really technical stuff, is they were captured progressive. So we did not have a higher frame rate than what we had. But to do these interlace artifacts, you need, like, where was actually the person that moved in between this frame and this frame? Because a field would have been recorded in between that with like a shorter exposure time.
So to emulate it, you need to oversample the temporal resolution then, right? So if you're doing 30 interlaced, you actually need to shoot 60p.
Exactly. Yep. But of course, and yeah, maybe the side note, if ever Hélène, well, she knows now, but if she would hear this podcast, well, yeah, exactly. For these ideas, it's great to talk to someone before you actually decide on what kind of camera and how to shoot this and so on. In this case, yeah, it would have helped if you only have like progressively recording cameras, then yeah, do it at a higher frame rate. So then you can easier and more accurately mimic that. So what what I had to come up with was, okay, we need to use optical flow interpolation to stretch it out to like 60 frames to actually really recreate frames like in between the real frames, so that you then can put these into different fields, then not deinterlace it, and then have this artifact. So if someone's interested and needs to know how, I have like an email that I wrote back then for the DI supervisor in the post house, because yeah, there was no money for VFX to do this and so on. So I had to figure it out by myself and then send basically a recipe to the post house, say, okay, all of these clips need to be processed like that and put them on a separate track, keep the old ones. So in case they don't like it, we can maybe blend it a little bit. And that's exactly what happened. Once I did it, and of course you have to lower the resolution from 4K, and we did a 4K DCP in the end. We had to, I think we went down to basically 540 from 2160. We went down to 450. So you had like 4 line thick fields. Otherwise, you wouldn't really notice the effect. And that's about the resolution that you would have had with MiniDV back then. Once they saw it, I was so happy that, well, it looks quite real. It was like, cool, but it's a lot here. Can we reduce it? And I was like, but that's not how it works. It's like when you shoot interlace, that's what it is. And you can either turn it on or off. But then, of course, yeah, we can, of course, now tweak it. And I think I did a combination of reducing the opacity, mixing it with the original, but then it creates like also different artifacts because you only have like the 25 frames there. And so that also didn't look like great if you do it too much. Then I added on top a little bit of motion blur again to blur some of the edges so that it wouldn't look so super edgy and harsh. Something that just is like completely not like scientifically, technically correct anymore. But apparently it kind of worked also for you, that if you believe that it was interlaced.
It's that one of my kind of my hobby horses to like rant about to my students is that oftentimes when we're emulating, in fact, in my experience, most of the time when we're emulating a certain format or period thing, we're not emulating the thing. We're emulating people's kind of fuzzy memories of the thing, their impressions of the thing. It's like if I wanted to, if someone says, I want the film look, you know, I'll show them like A Serious Man, which is a beautiful 4K transfer of, you know, Vision 2, 3, 500T. And they go, no, that looks too clean, too digital. And I'm like, well, this is an incredibly accurate depiction of what 35mm film looks like. And the same thing with MiniDV. It's oftentimes when I'm asked to emulate, you know, old 16, it's very frequent I'm asked to, because that's kind of become the thing I do in color in Vancouver a lot is I emulate shit. And I'd say people only go for the full accurate one 10% of the time, when they're asking for period emulation. And it's always this kind of game between people's expectations. And also, I mean, so much of what we see of as period aesthetics is colored by things like what transfer, like, for example, a lot of people's experiences of 90s cinema is just bad data cine transfers from the early 2000s that wash it out of the color or don't do any print film emulation and have just horrendous sharpening. So to them, that's what 90s cinema is, even though that is not really the case. So it's a minefield of things to navigate when you're developing that sort of look.
Couldn't agree more. And it's such an interesting topic and something you really encounter in a grading suite again and again, because everyone refers to films. We get these reference images sent. And I would say thanks to ShotDeck right now, they put a lot of effort in actually sourcing or using at least properly mastered Blu-rays these days. But on a lot of other things that you got in the past, screenshots from something where I don't know how many steps of transforms were in there from something that was an original 35mm frame that should have been projected with a xenon arc lamp in a dark room and so on. It's what people think this is the truth of how it looked, almost never is. And I became very kind of humble in my career when I understood that, and also how little I can trust my own memory of things if it comes to really objectively judging things and saying, no, this is how it looked like. It's I know I cannot tell. So I always say, this feels correct. This is probably closest. But I've encountered DPs and directors who were so certain. And then we bring up, in a film out, we bring up then the actual kind of digital file and then screen it in comparison to the film out or whatever, and it was okay, no, it actually it was a lot more greenish or something, whatever.
It's one of those moving, completely kind of ethereal targets, I guess. Your work on the PIMP, you brought this up to me as one of your only HDR grades, and that this had a very intense look development process that went from pre-production forward. So I'd love to hear about your experience working on that.
Yeah, happy to talk about that. Though it's maybe not very representative of my career because I only did work on 2 series so far. And this was the first one where I also did the final grading HDR first. I did grade a few HDR versions of feature films, but in my world, it's usually the art house feature films and so on. Not a high priority. And if no one pays for it, then no one's going to do it. So this was nice in that way, technically, that I could do the HDR first throughout a 6-episode series for Amazon. But also really because the DP, which I hadn't worked with before, called me up half a year before principal photography or something like that, or maybe at least 4 months, because I was recommended by some friends of his from his own studies at the film school, and he sent me the scripts. He really pitched the project in a nice way that convinced me that he's really hoping to do something special in terms of the look, and he really likes the scripts, the whole team, the director of the production company, who's very supportive, and was also very supportive in whenever he wanted or we wanted something to do a proper look development test. But here it really started by, okay, pitch the stories to me. Okay, what kind of ideas you have? What kind of reference do you have already? And he sent me this 150-page PDF that was collected by the production designer with stills from the actor. It's based on some actual historical figures from the 1980s in Hamburg in Germany, in the Red District. So there's great footage, great photography from that time. And there was one particular music video that used footage from that area from about that time. It had a very interesting look. It was obviously shot on film stock, but being part of a music video, like some techno video, no vocals, they had used quite some liberty in really grading it in an interesting way with lots of diffusion and so on. But you could still sense some of those image attributes coming from the photochemical capture process. And that was a great start to talk about this, to really dig into what do you like about this? Why do you pick this, and or some other of the stills? So I could understand not only his kind of taste, but also what he uses to describe that. And that's a very important part. If we talk about look development, we have to talk about the vocabulary that we use to describe images. Otherwise, it's really just like, oh yeah, I like this, I like that. Okay, but why? Sometimes I get pictures as references without any comment, and then I'm like, okay, they're so diverse, they're so different to me when I analyze them technically or whatever, that I'm kind of lost. And only when you speak to them, say, yeah, here I like the skin tones, here I like the texture on the wall there, because that's a similar color to our set. That's all kind of information that you need. And with Tim Kuhn, the DP of Luden, I actually really shared some information, some links, especially to the Steve Yedlin talk about display preparation. And I don't know if you really read the On Color Science article that he wrote, but we talked about these image attributes and the categories that, for me at least, kind of Steve defined in a very academic and interesting way, and that I really kind of picked up on and thought, oh, that's a great way to make this approachable in an objective way. But I found it also very intimidating for people that are not used to deal with what a digital picture is, how do you come up with the term of highlight roll-off or highlight compression and shadow detail if you haven't heard it before and have experienced what a certain process does to a picture. So doing this with students in my educational career, I had that experience, like talking about this display prep demo and showing it to students. I always knew it's quite difficult to grasp the idea of intrapixel and spatial and temporal, as he calls these categories. And then I thought, okay, let's rephrase it a little bit in a way that's more comprehensible and tangible, and call it, this is about the color of every little single pixel in that picture. And the second category is about everything texture, everything that is, where is the pixel in this picture? And how do they interact with the neighboring or other pixels? Are they darker at the corner? Then maybe that's because of some vignetting that could come from the lens or from this kind of process. Or are they more blurry because of the lens on the edge and more sharp, like in more high contrast in the center? And so on. And then the third category is temporal or motion, because for motion to happen in a frame, we actually need time to pass. Something has to have passed or moved from one part in the frame to another part, and that creates some kind of motion blur. Or just the fact that we do like 24 or 5 or whatever frames per second with a certain exposure time makes a difference from frame to frame. With noise or grain, we have a different pattern every other frame. So grain is, for example, an attribute of a digital picture that belongs to the temporal aspect or the category, because it changes from frame to frame. But it's also a spatial aspect because it's usually not a single pixel, but surrounding pixels as well that become brighter or darker or tinted in a certain color. So that is spreading basically into all categories, which affects color, space, and time, basically.
one of the, I think, things that you brought to this that I really appreciate is that, I mean, I had frankly been teaching using the intrapixel spatial temporal language for so long, and I'm a stickler for language. And for me, I often find a struggle to, almost make language accessible. That's a thing you got to do as a teacher. And the terms that you use, which are texture, color, and motion/time, are just much more intuitive for people. Part of what we're kind of advocating for, I think, each in our own way, is this idea of not treating images as this kind of mystical thing that gets formed due to some sort of format choice or bundle of things, that we can break it down into these component parts, each of which has a specific objective definition. And you can, like, for example, when I'm asked to color grade a film, like right now I'm working on a feature that we're trying to emulate a certain kind of, I'd say, slightly vague idea of modern 35 millimeter. And so being able to say, okay, so you've given me the still from, a mid 2010s shot in 35 film. So let's break it down to the texture, the grain, focus, sharpness. Let's break it down to chroma. How do skin tones react? What is the overall push of the highlights of the image? Time. Are we going to, one, I mean, a lot of the time stuff is just baked in, but, should I apply gate weave? Are we going to apply a flicker? That sort of thing. So all three of these things are variables we can attenuate in post-production.
Yeah, absolutely. Steve Yedlin says himself in the display prep demo that he's a big fan of what the photochemical process does. And even claims, oh, maybe I'm not very imaginative, I think he says. But I just love what film looks like. And what he did, compared to many other cinematographers, and that's also why he came up with this, he really analyzed what does this photochemical process do, from the actual capture on negative to the print and the various print versions and so on, and made or found a way for him to emulate these individual attributes so that he could mimic, even when he shot on digital cameras, and it doesn't matter what kind of digital camera, he was able to mimic that image processing to achieve a result that was indistinguishable from, oh, it was shot on 35 and this was shot on whatever digital camera, and it just looks the same. And that is something I actually saw or witnessed at Camera Image in 2016. In 2015, you did the display prep demo, but that was just the month after my daughter was born, so I wasn't there. But the next year I was there, and I saw the resolution demo, where he basically included just even more digital cameras that were indistinguishable from each other. And it was like, wow, it was blowing my mind. And finding out about the way how he described this and came up with this objective tool set how to analyze images was great. Yeah.
I think it's worth underlining too how radicalizing those two demos, the display prep and resolution demo, were for many of us. I think your story is shared by myself and many, many others, where we saw those, and yeah, it's like the whole, like, it kicked open a door in a lot of our heads, trying to go like, okay, this isn't some sort of immutable quality. There's nothing essential about any of these things. There's nothing essential about film that, when translated to a digital screen, or even often, like, I mean, I've also had the experience of, I saw The Hateful Eight. I remember this very well. I saw The Hateful Eight 2 days in a row for some reason. I think I just said yes to too many people. And once on and this exact same cinema, once on 70 mil, once on a 4K projection, could not tell the difference. It was virtually an identical experience. It was very interesting. In many ways, I preferred the digital because it was a little brighter. And I thought that served the cinematography a little better, but it was a very similar viewing experience. And I've had that again and again in years. It's like seeing The Big Lebowski on 35, seeing the actual Deacon's proper transfer of that. I think a lot of weight is put into the image capture medium, and my friend Troy will cut my head off over the term capture, but whatever. Image capture medium, when so much of these attributes that you're listing here are essentially, again, assuming one has captured that data intelligently and thoughtfully, are essentially generated via the imaging pipeline, rather than what sensor you're using.
Mm-hmm. He also, when asked what he would define his kind of job or skill set or profession besides being a cinematographer, he said like an image pipeline expert, which is said it's the pipeline that defines the outcome of the picture. And if you're able to manipulate and in that case emulate exactly what happened to the photochemical material on something that was digitally acquired, you have an indistinguishable outcome. A lot of people, cinematographers, and especially, of course, film lovers, enthusiasts, and cinematographer or Kodak representatives don't like that, to hear that, and I know that a lot of, or some of them, are not big fans of myself because of that. That I'm saying, well, I don't think you can distinguish that. I think it doesn't matter. That is not to say that I don't like what Kodak did and that it's not important what they did, and that acquisition on 35 is something you should never do. On the contrary, I mean, Happy's Lazarro was shot on 16mm. It was actually the decision from the director to go this open gate after she saw the telecine, which was done open gate just so they could move around in editing. It made clear the decision. Okay, now we got to reframe. It was originally framed for 185, but then after 2 weeks or so, they decided, okay, we're going to go open gate. And this would not have happened if it was shot on a digital camera where they just decide, okay, it's this. And you would not have this edge of this kind of slightly dirty, rough edge of the 16mm open gate, which I had then to kind of cut out and put on some of the digital shots in the film to make it consistent.
I was wondering that too.
Yeah, of course. We had to. There's also some shots where we had to zoom in or we had to stabilize and something like that. And then the edge is gone. And so I just painted it out from one still and then put it on top again. And that's all great things that would not have happened if this film would have not captured on photochemical film. But the one point is where I struggle when people don't make the effort of exploring and researching what it is they like about it and make an informed decision for a project. What is the best tool now to achieve that look? Because I've also worked in projects and or know about projects where I think it was the wrong decision for other reasons, maybe for budget reasons, maybe for workflow reasons, maybe they could have had shot a couple of more takes and it would have helped them in editing, actually, if they would have not been restricted by, oh, we shoot on film and we only have so much footage, we cannot afford more because of all the processing, blah, 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 and scanning. I think in one way, the film would have at least benefited from shooting it digital. And it would have been possible. Today, it is really possible for almost everyone to emulate the look in a completely convincing way. And yeah, referring to the link here again, he also answers those questions where people say, yeah, but I can see a difference between this and that. And I'm sure this is shot digitally. And then he shows, I don't know, 3-4 different scans from different film labs in LA. And they all look different. And again, it's like, where's the ground truth of how film looks?
This can even be expanded to a sort of idea that there's something essential about any given format. I just recently released a very grumpy video essay about large format and format size misconceptions. And it's very interesting to me seeing the response to that. That's actually the first podcast episode that's coming out in a little bit. Mm-hmm. It's basically us responding to all the very silly arguments that come. The idea that, for example, format size has some inherent perspective effect that you can't get by just attenuating focal length to match it, right? That sort of thing. Almost a rebuttal that I vehemently disagree with to what you're saying, and not disagree with you, but disagree with the rebuttal. I'm pre-butting. Is this, but what's the harm, right? What's the harm in shooting on film if you really want to? And to me, there's fact that, resources are scarce. We live in a homeostatic world where, if you spend money in one thing, you're spending by definition less than another, unless your name rhymes with Tusk. We're operating on the presumption that, for example, I've had students who have spent 3/4 of their budget because they really wanted to shoot 16, or went 70 grand into debt because they want to buy an Arri Alexa LF when it was new. That's a true story. Because of the large format, there's a lot of waste, especially, that can come from not really knowing the cause and effect, or the actual impact of the tools one has. Because I completely agree that there are very valid process reasons for shooting on film that I find very interesting. And far be it from, I think, anyone to either of us to say use acrylic instead of oil paint or whatever. If someone is operating on the assumption that a format does X, Y, and Z when it doesn't, that's the cinematic equivalent of a placebo medication.
Mm-hmm.
Very expensive placebo.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's a complex story, and it's also difficult to maneuver sometimes, depending on the people who are in the room and with whom you're talking. Being at Camera Image for many years, hearing a lot of people there, knowing a lot of cinematographers who had thought about shooting this or shooting that, who done workshops with very well-known DPs, promoting shooting on film and so on. I have to come to the conclusion that a lot of them don't consider what you just said about the influence of other cinematographers that maybe are pushed into a decision that just objectively assessed is not a good one, because you're spending or too many of your resources into one thing for the wrong reason, because you think or you're told you cannot achieve this in any other way, but you have to buy this camera, or you have to shoot with that camera, or you have to shoot on film.
There's a lot of kind of this idea that, hey, X film was shot on Y camera, and I want X film's aesthetic, or I want to impart the aura of X film, which might be a more accurate way to put it. So therefore, I use that tool instead of, and then they get their rushes back, and it doesn't look like X film because it's not the tool that does it. I think we can apply some of this to Secret Agent, which you very generously sent over, not only stills from the film, but pre-grade stills, Rec 709 stills, and also a node chart from DaVinci Resolve, which this makes me very happy to see. Seeing this here, we have another Tetra user among us, so I'd love to talk about Secret Agent, which is, I think, if you're listening to this podcast, listeners, and you haven't seen Secret Agent, go watch it and then come back. You owe it to yourself to watch this movie. But yeah, I'd like to hear you cook on that process.
It also links quite nicely, I believe, to the topic about shooting film or not, and what is the film look, and how much do we want it. In thinking about how we achieved eventually that look, I came to the conclusion what was most, or I remembered from the sessions, the most important terms for the director were authentic, or authenticity, and like a hot glare. He wanted to feel the sun of his hometown, Recife, in North Brazil. Ideally, really visually, physically feel that pressure on your eyes where you have to squint when you go out. And he wanted to be authentic to that period as much as the film tries, with every setup, with every location, with all of the actors and the characters in the film, to be authentic to this age or period in 1977 in northern Brazil under the military dictatorship. This feeling of oppression where, go and watch the film and then you just understand.
We'll throw up some stills as we go too. And what I find interesting is that the film feels period accurate. And actually, I mentioned Secret Agent. I was just talking about it to some friends, and they were all shocked it wasn't shot on film, which is interesting to me because I think the film doesn't look like any film stock I'm familiar with. It has its own unique thing. It's almost using certain tells, certain things we associate with film to build a new, almost like it's a tough film to look at. It's a film where, and I'm going to show the screen on here, where the highlights scream at you. There's a visual tension that is built between the fact that a lot of the characters are kind of almost competing for our visual attention with these blown out often backgrounds. And it gives the film, even in its least story level suspenseful scenes, a real tension that never really lets up except for certain like nighttime scenes, for example, where they're the long scenes where they're connecting in various apartments.
Very happy that you say that for you it didn't look like any film store, because that was never our intention. Authenticity here, that's why I tried to describe it, was about the atmosphere and the feeling of this oppression and so on. To be authentic to that period, of course, means, and the director has been a film critic himself, and he's still curating cinema, so he's a total film buff, and he uses references to other films from that period all the time. So it had to be somehow based on how films from that period looked. But that was about it. It kind of informed us, but we were never going after this 100% film emulation of a specific print of negative and print film stock from that period. That was it wasn't even part of the discussion. So I'm actually really happy that you kind of noticed that. And I understand that some people might think, yeah, it looks like it was shot on film because there's so much grain on it and but there are more aspects.
This actually reminds me of a conversation I had with Chris Blofeld about First Cow. That film got a lot of acclaim for its grain, because, I mean, I love the grain of that film. It's beautiful. And he was just like, yeah, we just put a ProRes real grain loop over it, right? And it's not meant to be accurate. It's just meant to be, hey, he has these tools that they form an image that does what he and Kelly Reichardt want to do with that movie. And yet, because we notice consciously grain, we go, must have been shot in film. No other way you can do that. You can tell. One kind of little almost thing that occurs to me is I want to kind of break apart what elements of this look you see as pre-existing in just the flat Rec 709, right? The version that in the image that you have as a colorist not curated, basically. What is introduced in the grade, and what is, even if the grade has been pre-planned and they're seeing some mock-up of it on set, in just that look development step that you partake in, what is introduced there that isn't present in the original image, basically, just so we can like pull those two strings apart a little. And I want to also asterisk the use of the word original. This is, the Rec 709 image you're seeing on here is what I would also call an aesthetically arbitrary intermediate state, right? This is not an image meant to be ever seen. If one looks at the before and after and go, I like the before or something, what you're seeing is, it's almost like you throw a dart at the wall and it randomly hits and you haven't hit the bullseye. That's how much relationship this image has to the final developed look.
Well, yes, but in a case of a cinematographer, if you don't have done any look development and you just go out and apply the in-camera display conversion to what we call Rec 709, well, then that's how it would look. So on location, if you wouldn't have any pre-made lookup table, that's how it looks, and that's a kind of intended to be a technically correct representation of what you would actually see with your eyes on location, on set. So it's a starting point. And for anything that's not going on air directly, it's really just a starting point for the final grading then. But what you can see in here, and I really like that shot, and the DP Evgenia Alexandrova also, when they kind of picked stills for the press work and release of it, well, that's probably, well, not the 709 version that you see now, but this graded version. She really liked that to represent the kind of visual aesthetic of the film quite a bit. And I was looking at it and said, yeah, it's also almost like a perfect test shot. If we would have had the chance to do a look development before she was going to shoot, which we didn't have on this film, that would have been an ideal picture because it contains like 4 quite different skin colors, a good variety of colors in the shirt. So we see, for the audio podcast listeners, we see like the main character, Wagner Moura, but also like 3 other guys, everyone's kind of bad in this film, so some kind of villains there in like different costumes from red to brown, a jacket and a tie and so on. But we also see a kind of signature color in the film, the yellow phone booth behind the actor. We have some little bright green from a tree in the corner, and we have some, again, like glaring bright sunlit area on the background, some kind of white pieces on the building. If I go back to the 709 version of that, those elements are already there. What they picked in production design, in costumes and so on, that's already there. The separation between the people and the background, the staging and so on, that's all there. And what we tried is to kind of carve out, as with the overall look, to carve out the little differences or bigger differences even more, to have some like stronger colors like the yellow and some other. If you watch the film, there are a couple of very nice dark reds. Like the phone itself in the phone booth has this nice strong red color, which we pushed a little darker than it actually is to give it this kind of almost burgundy-ish purple dark color. And that's all part of our recipe that we kind of put forward.
Because it's interesting to me, like I love this shot as a case study in this, because the original shot, I mean, you obviously have, so the Rec 709 has 4 people in the foreground who are lit relatively dimly compared to the background, right? The background is a number of stops brighter. And so that still exists in the color graded version, or the look development, post-look development, final version of the image. But what's been introduced is, for example, a kind of a color rhythm between the foreground and background, because the highlights have been pushed very yellow compared to the Rec 709. But the foreground elements, like for example, the skin tones remain kind of, anchored in the, I'd say the quote unquote technically correct place. And then you have a lot more mid-tone contrast in the foreground introduced, so that it doesn't feel like a 2-dimensional bit of micro contrast in front of a super bright background. Your eyes can latch on to those differences in, like, the highlights of the character's features versus the shadows. And that is compositionally potent. But then you have the kind of the wider composition where there's another tension between the hyper overexposed like white arches and the middling to low exposure of the foreground characters. It feels like the color is leveraging the strengths of the composition and also leveraging simultaneously the ability in the color suite to kind of finesse such an extreme composition, because this is a really risky shot. Imagine shooting this on film without a DI, right? This would be incredibly risky. To me, if anything, that marks this as like not a piece of like super rigorous, what Herzog might call like the accountant's truth of period emulation. It's not that, because if I'm like emulating a period, I would not actually compose a shot like this, because it would be probably not feasible to do reliably by most working cinematographers in the mid-century, right? That ratio would be on the edge of disaster. I can't think of many shots outside of like Cleo from 5 to 7, the park scenes there that really have this level of ratio in foreground and background. So hopefully that kind of sketches it out a little for the listeners in terms of what's so fascinating about the shot for me personally.
If I go to one of the other kind of signature shots that was also used for marketing the film, I think, I'm sure you can. Well, they picked for the actual poster, they picked a different one, but on a lot of the marketing, you would see this pose of Wagner Moura leaning against the pole here at the gas station of the opening scene. The opening scene in itself is like worth a whole kind of case study, and Evgenia, the DP, could talk about it also. It was shot over multiple days, and it was sometimes raining, sometimes not, sometimes super sunny, sometimes all shadowy. So the grading for this also took quite a bit. But here, I actually prepared a bit of a build of the various steps introduced, especially also in texture. If we go here with there's a magnification of his face, so you can actually really see what happens on the texture as well. So we start out again with like the Rec 709 version, without any balancing and with a lot of the warm touch. I apologize for that. I realized later I should have done it the other way around, but then it was too late because I had to do it in a grading suite. I don't have the footage anymore and so on. But just to illustrate what we've done also to the texture, I think it's still valid and works. So there is in the recipe, you're going to see you're going to show and talk about the node tree a little bit. But besides a print and negative emulation that is dialed in and then pretty manipulated, especially in terms of the highlight rollout and compression, a big part of the look is really what we did in terms of the texture with additional bloom, flare, lowering the resolution, and my beloved texture pop, which I've become very fond of in the last years, ever since Filmlight introduced the texture equalizer, and I was like, oh, that's so cool. And it was so complicated to build that with your own kind of node tree and try to manipulate that. So it was great that eventually, like magic, kind of copied that. And it's a really powerful tool that here really helps to create what you described on the previous still with the micro contrast in the faces to bring out the facial features, to push the highlights a little bit and darken the shadows, just even in the darker areas of the picture. So you can still kind of distinguish things further. So you can see some steps with the halation and bloom, extra grain.
And so halation being kind of the an emulation, one might say, of the way in which the perceptual way film highlights kind of bleed into neighboring areas, and then bloom is a more overall soft kind of softening of those same kind of high contrast edges, but in a less kind of localized way, I guess.
Exactly. And here I'm also referring to the terms that in this case, Dehancer, which was the only extra kind of plugin or tool within the system I had at that facility, how they call it. I've been using Filmbox Pro, just to not promote one. I've been using Look Designer in the past, for example, for the PIMP, to come up with some kind of filmy but not too specific film look. I've been recently using a DF Chromie and DF Funny from Hell Pictures, a French company, which is very cool, very detailed and powerful tool with pretty solid math behind as well. So I've been using whatever is available and possible. And then sometimes they call it bloom, sometimes diffusion, sometimes like this or that.
I think Filmbox calls it like aura or something. It's
yeah. Everyone calls it slightly different and has some little bit of different math. And it's nice playing around and figuring out what it is.
One extremely valuable thing that I almost never see is the thing that you've just brought up is your node chart. So for those of you on the audio land, Dirk has just brought up a screenshot from the interface of DaVinci Resolve, where we have a whole node chart for the look development part of the node chart, which is in the group post clip area. So this affects all of a certain group of clips. So this isn't like one shot color correction. This is affecting in bulk many clips theoretically, unless you have a very narrow group.
No, these days I really try to keep the number of groups as small as possible and be as generic and working as softly and broadly on everything as possible with the overall look. But there are sometimes this contemporary part in the film when the story jumps forward basically to today. And that, of course, is then a different post group or a different group, so that in the post group nodes, there's, for example, we dialed down the texture pop a lot to make it more soft and not as contrasty as the past of the film, basically.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a process where this still developed a little bit. The majority was done like in the first couple of days of grading using a specific print stock from Dehancer, negative and print stock, plus these settings, as I said, especially filling around with not sure how they called it, the highlight compression and highlight detail and so on to achieve this curve where we're really pushing against like basically the 100% clipping point, just so that we do have some detail in the clouds, for example, here, but they are just as bright as we can get it. Then to further work on this, there is like 2 nodes with some curves where we tweak that for highlights, for shadows. There is the tetra, you can see it here, where we push basically the greens overall. I like still the free tetra version, or the tetra DCTL, because it's just very smooth. It's just mathematically so simple and broad that it doesn't really introduce any artifacts other than the slicer, which you can also see here in the node tree, where I worked, I think, mostly on skin tones and yellows a little bit, like gently adding overall subtractive saturation and maybe a little bit of density extra for the skins, but very gently, because that is mathematically not as super clean as you would want it.
It has some hard edges. I think this whole cottage industry of hue modification DCTLs to make up for the math of that one.
And I use a bunch of them as well, especially for then LUT development, like from Cor Hendrickson, and mononodes from Stefan Ringelschwandner. Kind of, they usually are more kind of mathematically less prone to artifacts than what you have inside Resolve. Yeah.
And this gets at a kind of a key part of look development, like in a practical level, which is that it's pretty easy to develop a look that works in one shot. It's not that hard. It's very difficult to develop a look, or at least more difficult to develop a look that can not break 1,000 shots. Right. It's especially with Secret Agent, you have like some shots that have like, some shots where you have a dark character in front of a bright background, and you have another, other shots that are at night, with completely different kind of footprints out of camera, and having a strident and pretty, I'd say this film has a pretty like a powerful look that heavily modifies what we might call the base Rec 709 in pretty extreme ways. The fact that it doesn't break, I mean, I'm sure a lot of correction shot by shot goes into that, but creating a look that gets all those shots in line in a way that isn't just causing you weeks and weeks of headaches is something where that's why we have those tools that have elegant math, right? So that we don't induce breakage unnecessarily.
And still, you shouldn't push things too far, because of that, what can happen with those shots that you just don't see at the moment. Because even on good productions where everyone wants to do the pre-production look development and allows for shooting a test and so on, you will still not see some of the colors that are somewhere in a location that you cannot control, like super bright LED lights somewhere in a shop behind on the street that you cannot turn off and so on. And then suddenly you see, oh, in my color pipeline, it really works nicely for well-lit skin tones, but suddenly bright saturated colors just kind of explode and create these weird artifacts. That's something, well, once you experience that, you kind of try to foresee that, and you try to be gentle with certain adjustments. That's kind of part of what you should do as an experienced colorist if you try to create lookup tables for then the cinematographer really working with that. You should give them a tool that helps to make decisions, that helps them to do the best lighting they can do for that particular lookup table, but it should not restrict them or guide them in the wrong way. So, for example, you shouldn't mess with the white balance too much and make everything like the highlights just super, super warm or cold, because then you're basically probably ending up with the DP dialing against this at some occasions and not lighting it in the right direction, but lighting against something. The same with the sensitivity of the camera. You should not manipulate where mid-gray basically turns out to be after your lookup table. If that is too different from where the camera manufacturers place it, then something might happen, as happened with the people on a Pigeon when they just started learning how the red camera works, and they just rate it differently and think it's all too bright, so I rather kind of lower the exposure, and then you just not capture something. And that's what you really must not do. You should try to enable, as you said, aim a little higher so that you have rather more possibilities still and a bit of safety in the final grading than the other way around, pushing into a direction where you limit what you capture and your possibilities afterwards.
I think that's a very good note to kind of conclude on in the look development part, because so much of look development is kind of finding that nonlinear workflow, right? Where you are not thinking of it as this is the color step, but the color step informs how we shoot, and vice versa. One thing that we haven't really touched upon, but I think our listeners can probably glean from how well-spoken you are about all these issues and how communicative you are. You're also an educator, and you were a key part in the upgrade, I don't know, is it an initiative, can we call it?
It was an educational program. It was a full-time color grading education.
We met because you were giving a lecture on color and look development at the Berlinale Talents Lab. So your efforts in this realm continue in other venues too, which I love to see. I mean, your talk to us was, I think, a real high point of the whole conference for me. So if people want to hear you talk some more online in recording form, where can they find you?
They can go to my website, and I try to link whatever is available on the workshop and lecture section there. So the website is digital-film-services.com. That is a domain that I got back then, 2003, I believe, when we closed down Director's Friend, and I thought maybe we do this as a service. So it's easily mistaken for some kind of big company that does all kinds of services, but no, it's just me. I'm a freelancer. But I just hold on to that domain, and that's where you find links to a session that I did at Eurocine Expo, for example, that really is about look development, the terminology.
And I'm also glad that it's nice to meet someone who also has an overly broad company name that's really just me. I'm Moving Image Agency, which, I think I was trying to be ironic when I made that, but it ended up misleading many, many people. But thank you so much for stopping by. This has been a lovely conversation, and I'm sure that the probably incredibly winnowed down colorist crowd that is still with us at this point, I'm sure that this is one of those Velvet Underground things where 50,000 people bought the record, but they all started bands. Thank you so much for joining us on, actually, this is the first interview-based episode we're recording for Film Formerly Mark II.
And am I allowed to thank you very much?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Thank you for having me. It was a great pleasure. I barely met anyone being so interested in going so dedicated, deep into the films that I worked on, or watching all the lectures that are still online. So it was an honor, and also being your first interview partner here on this.
If nothing else, for all my personality flaws, I can say I try and do my homework.
Yeah, totally.
That was a good conversation, wasn't it?
Wow. I just heard that.
Just heard that live. We're here. We're here. Look at us. Visit filmformerly.com for archival episodes and show notes, a link to our Discord server, or just to say hi.
Film Formerly is a production of Sad Hill Media and Moving Image Agency.
Griffin Scheel is our editor.
If you enjoyed this episode, please rate us, review us on whatever podcast service you happen to use, or leave a comment on YouTube. Say you might have some thoughts that just kind of crossed your mind over this, or a question, observation. Maybe a million other people have said it. Just put it in there. Just type it in and say that we're good.
Do it. Do it now.